Now, David Hundeyin is, as I said, an award-winning investigative journalist, writer, and founder of the West Africa Weekly. And I'm very glad that he joins us now. David, welcome to the show. Before we get on to the serious stuff, how is Nigeria coping with the news that the British Conservative leader, Kemi Badenuff, has resigned as a Nigerian? She no longer identifies as a Nigerian. She told an anxious British public earlier this week. Does anyone give a toss in Nigeria? They certainly don't in Britain.
Well, she no longer identifies as Nigerian, and we in Nigeria no longer identify as interested in anything that Kemi Badenuff has to say. So good luck to her.
Now, look, I said in my monologue, Trump keeps publishing on Truth Social, on Twitter, and to anyone who'll listen, that he's stopped 5 wars in 6 months. But when you look at all the wars he says he's stopped, all of them are continuing. And some of them are in Africa. What does this mean? Does he really think that he's stopped them? Did people tell him that he'd stopped them, and then when his back was turned, carried on fighting? What's going on?
Personally, I think very often the mistake is made to sort of shield Donald Trump almost from valid criticism by saying, well, maybe he has someone who's in his ear telling him the wrong thing. I don't think he has someone in his ear telling him the wrong thing. I don't think he's a stupid person at all. I don't think he became the president of the United States of America by being a stupid person. I think he's a dishonest person. I think he knows very well that he has done no such thing that he's claiming to have done. But in the time-honored tradition of U.S., I guess, imperial way of dealing with the world, there's this idea that the actual material facts of the matter don't necessarily need to have any correlation whatsoever to the narrative that is being floated. And clearly, the narrative that he's trying to sell is that he deserves to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for supposedly being some sort of peacemaker, which he very clearly is not. In addition to not sorting out these conflicts he claims to have sorted out, he has actually fueled some of them. So, for example, his press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, came out and claimed that the Iran and Israel conflict was mediated by Donald Trump. Meanwhile, the Israelis themselves have said multiple times that the initial attack on Iran was coordinated with the Americans. They had the full knowledge and operational support of the Americans. They had full foreknowledge of it, and they had no problem with it. This has been confirmed multiple times. So essentially, this is someone who is a direct participant in this conflagration, claiming to have been responsible for dousing it. And then, obviously, in the case of conflicts like DR Congo and Rwanda, which he claims that he sorted out, all you have to do is just Google DR Congo, Rwanda today, and you realize that as recently as 3 days ago, there were still more rebel movements in the DR Congo. The material situation on the ground has not changed whatsoever. The so-called M23 movement is still holding and capturing more territory within the DRC. Nothing has changed. So yes, a piece of paper was signed in Doha under Trump's supposed mediation, but I don't think Donald Trump is a foolish person, and I don't think if you have the benefits of the world's most extensive intelligence network, which you would have as the president of the US, then you would make such statements in ignorance. I think he knows the facts of the matter on the ground, and I think he's just an extremely dishonest and disingenuous person, as US presidents tend to be.
Yeah, it might be part of the requirement on the CV, at least unspoken, if not explicitly. What about France now? We keep reading and cheering that France is being driven out of its long-held colonial fiefdoms in the continent of Africa. But they haven't gone away, you know. I see that they are now framing the conflict in Mali between the Mali government and the Al-Qaeda, ISIS, terrorists who are operating there. According to France, these Al-Qaeda, ISIS terrorists are the resistance, and they are resisting the Malian government and its Russian allies' attempts to douse the fanatic flames that have been set across the continent. Where do you stand on that? Can you tell us more?
Well, so I think this was 2 days ago, a documentary that was produced by a French government mouthpiece, ARTE, as you said, framed or made an attempt to frame the conflict in Mali as a conflict between this dictatorial regime and a group of freedom fighters who are fighting for an independent homeland and yada, yada, yada. Meanwhile, anyone who's followed this conflict for longer than 5 minutes knows that these elements that the French government's mouthpiece is trying to cast as freedom fighters are terrorists by the textbook definition of the term terrorist. As you said, elements of Al Qaeda and ISIS, elements of JNIM. This is what France is now attempting to typecast as some classic African governments versus rebel conflict. Even the use of terminology is very telling. At no point through that documentary was the word terrorist used, even though that's what these people clearly are, or the word Islamist, even though that's clearly what they are and claim to be. Instead, the word used to describe them is rebels, which is a loaded term because it's inferring that there is some sort of historical or ideological position that they are defending, and that the Malian government is, in some way in the wrong here. If you watch that documentary, you can't come away with any other conclusion. And this is how this is being framed. And what this tells me is that from the very start, the existence of these supposed terrorist entities in the Sahel, I think it's fair to say now that we could say with some measure of finality that the very existence of these groups in Sahel was at least in some form down to the French government. The French government has at the very least enabled the existence of these groups in the Sahel. These groups did not come into existence organically in the Sahel. Bearing in mind that in a country like Mali, for example, which has existed as a sovereign country for 60 plus years, and there has never been any serious debate about what the borders of Mali are or aren't, or what the borders of Burkina Faso are or aren't, or what the borders of Niger are or aren't. All of a sudden, as soon as these three countries make the decision to terminate their enslavement to France, to terminate these economic and diplomatic and military agreements with France and pursue their own sovereignty, all of a sudden you start having these supposed rebels coming out of the woodwork and claiming that they have some sort of historical claim to some land in northern Mali, some calling themselves Azawad Republic and all sorts of things. And then very tellingly, the French state media cannot platform these people enough. You see them on ART, you see them on RFI, you see them on France 24, you see them on AFP, you see them on Le Monde. They're just all over to hide the fact that it has taken a side, and that it has taken the side of these supposed terrorists. So over and above the conversation in the Sahel, what this also tells us about the very existence of terrorism as a political entity, I guess in the global south or in the world at large, is that these terrorists don't just spring into being because someone read some portion of the Quran and was inspired to become some sort of nut job. That's not how this happens. That this is high level political gamesmanship. This is geopolitics using a military sort of execution to achieve whatever goals that the French government or the US government or the various European governments or the UK government have. So this war on terror, which has been used as the pretext for essentially terrorizing the entire global south for the past 20 plus years, I think it's fair to say with some finality now that this entire thing was a giant head fake. This entire thing was what you would call some sort of false flag operation. And unfortunately, we're living in the middle of it. here in West Africa.
And even our gallant captain, Ibrahim Traore, even he's having to fight these same so-called rebels that in any other country would be called Islamist fanatic terrorists, ISIS, Al-Qaeda. Well, unless it was in Syria, of course. The fluidity of defamation, the ontology of all this is simply bewildering. Someone's an Islamist fanatic terrorist if they're running through the Champs-Élysées murdering people, but they're rebels if they are in Africa, even though they are exactly the same people with exactly the same ideology and even the same names of their organizations. Tell us how Burkina Faso is coping with this terror threat.
So I guess unlike Mali, Burkina Faso's advantage is that its landmass is significantly smaller and it doesn't directly share a border with countries that are actively enabling some of these Islamist entities. So Mali shares borders with Mauritania and Algeria, which have been proven multiple times to be providing cover to these entities for various reasons. Burkina Faso, apart from the challenge of being bordered by Cote d'Ivoire, doesn't necessarily have that problem. So it's less, I guess, prone to these, large-scale attacks that keep on happening in Mali. Which is not to say that Burkina Faso has got away scot-free. It hasn't. But the, I guess, geopolitical sweet spot that Ibrahim Traore now sits in is that, first of all, there's the military partnership with Russia and with North Korea, which has made it a much less attractive proposition to attack Burkina Faso in the ways that these entities used to before. And then secondly, and perhaps just as importantly, the immediate southern neighbor of Burkina Faso, Ghana, is now very closely aligned with what Ibrahim Traore is trying to do. Bear in mind that one of Burkina Faso's biggest geological disadvantages is that it has no direct access to the sea. It has no direct access to global trade. It's landlocked. So as a result, it's dependent on the foreign policy of the countries around it, which is a weakness. And during the presidency of the last president of Ghana, which was very, very Western aligned, that was a problem for Burkina Faso. Getting access to the sea. So, for example, the equipment that needs to be imported, it was a problem. That is no longer the case because the presidency of John Mahama in Ghana has effectively turned Ghana into Burkina Faso's de facto port. So, almost on a daily basis, you're seeing these large-scale deliveries of equipment, and it's becoming increasingly clear, even to people in Ghana who aren't even in Burkina Faso, who are just watching these things, just constantly coming into the port and going up 600 kilometers up the road. It's becoming increasingly clear that what we're witnessing is not a flash in the pan, that what we're witnessing is the industrialization of a country in real time. What we're witnessing is also the buildup of a small-scale military-industrial complex in Burkina Faso. So already they're starting to do things like drone manufacturing. So unlike the US or EU idea of what a drone is, these guys have created a sort of a very creative spin on drone warfare. So they've repurposed civilian drones and they've used items from civilian equipment such as phone cameras. And what this has done is that they've been able to create a so-called kamikaze drone, a suicide drone, for a unit cost of about $5,000, which is really, really cheap in military terms. So whereas an Iranian Shahed drone costs, I think, $30,000 a piece, an American one costs anything from $200,000 to several million a piece. A Burkinabe suicide drone, which is extremely effective against these terrorist actors, is costing $5,000 a piece, and they're able to produce these at scale. And that is what is shifting the balance of power on the military front. So they're basically taking the lemons that geopolitics has given them, and they're making a whole lot of lemonade out of it. I, for one, I'm really enjoying watching it.